Thank you very much for having me here. It's a great pleasure. I'm a great fan of the SFI, and I was feeling privileged to be invited here. I'll try to catch up a bit on time and just summarize a few thoughts. Hopefully I can manage to squeeze it into just 10 minutes or so. So allow me just to formulate ideas that I find relevant for practitioners like myself. Number one, human thinking tends to be highly linear. Remember, the way we try to solve daily problems at work or at home is usually by thinking about how we solved them in the past. That's how we grew up from early childhood onwards. We memorize or we draw upon our collective experiences, upon the stuff we learned at school and the stuff we learned from experience, and try to apply that to deal with today's challenges in order to shape tomorrow, right? And the reason I mention that is because it illustrates how human logic works. It functions like an arrow, moving from past experience to understand and address the present and to shape the future. The trouble is, and this is where it becomes relevant for practitioners, I would argue that in the 21st century, we are indeed witnessing more structural, non-linear change than previous generations most likely ever did. And forecasts break apart when linear thinking tries to interact with non-linear developments. That's part of what I would call a new world order. There is, to illustrate just one or two, an unprecedented demographic change taking place around the world. It took, remember, no more than 2 generations for the world's population to more than triple. 2 generations ago, there were roughly 2 billion people on Mother Earth. Today, it's 7.5. 1 generation down the road, most likely that's going to peak at maybe 9 billion according to United Nations forecasts, however rough they are. At the same time, we recognize that in the emerging world, where most of this growth comes from, half of the people are younger than 30. And remember, it was that type of demographic dividend which lifted post-war Europe, United States, and Japan. Whereas in the developed economies, we face an earthquake, the silver surfers about to retire, with massive implications on the pension system, on government funds, and therefore on our bond yields. Because it's the silver surfers retiring with largely unfunded retirement prospects, which forces pension funds and insurance companies to become ever more risk-averse as they realize they need to pay for more retirees for longer than they actually expected, because most likely, most of us, if not us, then our children will live happily up until we're 100 years old. And that's quite likely to happen. Now, another important theme is there's not only structural change driven by demographic change, by technological and scientific change, which you see in every industry you witness. There's a liquidity tsunami that is trying to buy the developed world time. It reminds me of a rather iconic movie. I'm a great movie fan. Some of you might know the movie that was produced in the 1980s, A Weekend at Bernie's. Europe currently reminds me a little bit of The Weekend at Bernie's, the story of 2 mediocre sales agent and insurance companies who are invited to Bernie's, their boss, in his villa at the Hamptons for a great party. When they arrive there, they unfortunately find out Bernie has been shot by some evil gangsters. But they were really looking forward to the party and wanted to have it continue. And then they decide that they put Bernie on a rocking chair, and one of them moves, keeps him rocking so that the other can enjoy the party. You can imagine, that's a great comedy that was produced in the 1980s. And of course, you know, isn't Europe a little bit like that? We keep the economy on liquidity supply in order to buy us time and to enjoy the party, right? It may be a little too cynical, but there is something to be said that we are buying time by using the liquidity tsunami for partly a good purpose, because I see a big a big shift in the political elite's thinking that has experimented with low interest rates and that has experimented with demand policies and figured out none of this creates jobs. And there's a broad consensus amongst the political elite, whether they're left or right doesn't matter, that the only thing that gets you re-elected in politics is if you can make a credible argument you've contributed to lowering unemployment, to creating jobs. So my sense is, across Europe, the political elite is trying to experiment with supply-side reform, which I think is good. But unfortunately, that takes time. And that's what Draghi and Mrs. Yellen in the United States are providing. They're buying that. Now, putting all that together, my sense is the world economy is probably in better shape than the media are trying to suggest to us. The media must suggest everything is going awry because bad news is good news in the media industry, as you might or might not agree with. But I think it's in better shape. The demographic dividend is actually very powerful. Technological, scientific support and buying time through monetary policy, if it helps for a good purpose, can actually end better than many people think. Another important theme, however, that does keep me awake at night is commodity markets. Yes, this might just cause an unexpected bottleneck in commodities, driven, of course, by demographic growth and changing lifestyles. China is the example in case. China is urgently running out of groundwater. Their aquifers are essentially emptied. China knows that and is building 450 massive desalination plants, which will all go live this year and next year. And when they go live, they'll figure out the most important cost in running them, in running these desalination plants, is not labor, but it's actually power, because the way they work is they pump seawater through strong membranes to get fresh water, and a very simplistic analysis yields that that's going to add something like $60 billion in extra power costs per month. So that's something like $700 billion per year extra power cost. I mentioned this example to illustrate an important point. Food, power, and other commodities, they're all the same, because 2/3 of water demand goes into agriculture. Without water, there's no agriculture. And in the 21st century, without power, there's no water, no fresh water in the most demographically populated parts of the world. And without fresh water, it's difficult to imagine how we produce food only from saltwater vegetables. So a new world order is rising, and it's not, I believe, the popular narrative of the East versus the West, something you can pick up at any airport bookshop. You can pick up at least a dozen books that tell you that, you know, the rise and decline of nations, and that compare what happens to the developed world to the old Rome, and says everything is better in the East than in the West. I don't buy into that story. My sense of history is that it's not so much driven by region, but rather by the power of ideas. As Victor Hugo is quoted to have said, the power of an idea whose time has come is stronger than all of the world's armies. If there's just one idea that I want to conclude with that I believe is going to be much more powerful in shaping a new world order, it's not East or West. In China, people always ask me, will this be China's decade? In India, they always ask me, will this be India's decade? It may be, but it may also end in tears. The point is, only those countries or regions that understand and appreciate, I believe, the necessity and the power of sustainable development at the three most important levels, a political national level, a commercial business level, a managerial level, if you will, and thirdly, an individual investor's level. Only those regions that will really appreciate and embrace that idea will prosper in the longer term. And that illustrates, by way of example also, the opportunities, but equally the responsibilities which I believe we bear as investment managers and investors out of Switzerland. Thank you very much for having me.